Good afternoon and welcome to the last in this series of 4 sessions on A-level history. Tonight's focus will be Unit 4 with Miss Thomas, and I shall hand you over now. Thank you, Miss.
Thank you very much. So hello again, I'm Karen Thomas and I'd like to welcome you to today's A-level presentation. Now this is my second session, but it's of course the 4th session overall. Now don't forget that you're able to access all of the previous recordings if you missed any and the resources that went with them from the previous sessions. They are all on the link here on the website, and I'll come back to that link later on in the PowerPoint just to remind you on how to access it exactly. Now, A-level history. So my presentation today is going to follow the same style as the last one. The presentation itself will take around about 35 minutes. And if you have any questions, you can submit them using the chat function during the presentation. And I'll go over as many as I can live in the last 5 minutes or so of the session. So this presentation today. So this session is actually going to focus on Unit 4, question 2/3, which is the essay question. But before we actually go into that question 2/question 3, I'd like to refresh what we did last session and look at the overview of the whole A-level course to begin with, and then look at the source skills in question 1. That should take us about 15 minutes. So looking back over how we analysed the sources, the write-up, top tips, looking at the WJC expectations and turning them into student-friendly language, looking at the couple of checklists that we worked through, looking at some of the sentence starters that you could possibly use, and then ending by looking at the WJC banding for the top banding of the level 6. I will then focus on question 2/3, which is the essay question, which is when you get 2 essays and you choose 1 to do. So this session is going to hopefully refresh your source skills, not just from last session, but also refresh your source skills from year 12, of course, because the question 1 in year 13 is very similar to your question 1 in year 12. But also I'm going to be using, obviously, or you're going to be using your essay skills, maybe essay skills from previous units. So it's going to be a mix of perhaps new ideas, but also refinding and using these essay skills that you already have. So let's look quickly at the overview of A-level history. So in year 13, you complete 3 units. So your unit 3 was explained by Mr. Morel. So you've got your breadth study, and he explained them on Tuesday the 2nd and Tuesday the 9th of March. And the depth study, which is what I explained last session on the 16th, when we explained question 1, and then question 2/3 is what we're going to be doing today. Now your unit 5 is the non-examination assessment. So basically 60% of the course is actually covered in year 13. Now remember, even though we won't be going down the traditional routes of external exams this year, you'll probably be required to answer past paper questions as part of your end of year assessments. So I'm hoping that this presentation will be extremely valuable to you to help you to prepare for this task now that you're back in school or sixth form colleges. Now you want to get the best mark possible in your assessment as evidence that you are capable and that you can produce work at this particular standard or grade. So as an overview of Unit 4, your question 1 is the compulsory source-based question, and your question 2/3 will be to do 1 essay from the choice of 2. So we have 8 depth study topic areas, and if you joined my session last week, you remember me saying that I would have loved to have done a session for you on the historical context or content in these depth studies. But as I said, it would have been an impossible task because what you study in your sixth form or your college would be different to what somebody else actually studies. So what I'm going to do, I'll run through the 8 depth study topic areas, and hopefully you will know what depth study topic area you learn from, sorry. So you might be doing depth study topic 1, which would be part 2, challenges facing Mary and Elizabeth, or maybe you're doing part 2, which is Civil War, Commonwealth and the Protectorate. Now remember, part 1 was what you did in year 12, and part 2 is what you would do in year 13 as your unit 4. Maybe you are doing part 2, protest and campaigns, which is from depth study 3, or maybe you are doing economic and social challenges in Wales, which is from depth study 4. Doing the spread of Protestantism and Counter-Reformation, which is from depth study 5, or maybe you do depth study 6, which is France in Revolution. Maybe it's part 2, which is Civil War and Reconstruction, which comes from the Crisis of the American Republic, which comes from Depth Study 7. Maybe you're doing Germany, Democracy and Dictatorship, and the part 2 in year 13 is Nazi Germany, 1933 to 45. Now, with regards to content, this is a depth study. So for question 1 and for the 2 essays that we'll be looking at during the course of this session, you need to look at the specification for your particular depth study. And you have to make sure you know and understand each key issue within the specification. Now, you probably have been given your specification from your school or college. If you haven't, or it's mislaid, then you can go on the WJEC site and you can find your own particular depth study. Now, when you do find it would look like this. So this is from Depth Study 1. So basically these 4 areas you need to know something about, because these are what you could be tested on for question 1 and for your essay question 2/3. So that's Depth Study 1. Now, we know now that the question 1 and the question 2/3 normally traditionally would make up the exam, but you are going to be turning that into assessments for the current year group. Now, the overview for question 1 and question 2/3 is what I'm going to show you now. So question 1 is your source question. So it will always start with the same stem. So you have, with reference to the sources and your understanding of the historical context, assess the value of these 3 sources to an historian studying, and it will always be worth 30 marks. So what we have here is an example. We've got Depth Study 1, so you'll see that the sources are now more in depth for year 13 compared to year 12. You have your question directly underneath, okay, and if we look at the stem of the questions, this is a Depth Study 1 question and a Depth Study 6, we will see the stem never changes. What changes is the actual key issue, which comes out from your depth study, and it's the same for every single depth study. So we have the essay question, which is question 2/3, and you would choose one essay from the choice of 2. And again, this is worth 30 marks. So if we zoom in the questions from this Depth Study 1, these are the 2 essays, and you would choose to do either question 2 or question 3, and you can see the markings there, 30 marks. This is an example from Depth Study 6. So we are quite clear that for Unit 4, we need to make sure that we have source skills and excellent source skills, and also that we need to brush up on our essay skills, because these are the 2 areas that this unit focuses in on. So let's have a quick revisit at last session on the question 1 and the main points that we looked at there. So, and that in the checklist, when you have your sources, you need to identify the key issue that is in the question. So you need to be highlighting and underlining whatever the focus is on your particular key issue. You then need to look at the provenance of the source. So you're looking at the attribution to find out what date it was written, who the author was, who the audience would be likely be, the form it takes. What that means is it a speech or a newspaper report or maybe a book? The language used, that's linked to the tone, which I'll come to in a second, and any additional information on the topic area. Now remember, with that, it has to be in relation to the source. You can't just explain everything you know about the topic area. It has to tie in with the actual source context, okay, and that's very, very important. You would then look at the source content. You would look at the tone of the source, so you'd be looking at the language being used, looking at the reliability, which I'll go into a bit more detail in a second, and also being able to give a judgment. Now remember, with this checklist, you don't do it in order, you would do it in a free-flowing way, but all of these areas should be covered to access the top marks for the source analysis. Now remember, you are highlighting your main point, your specific key issue. So we zoomed in on this particular question last session, which was from Depth Study 8, which was about the change in treatment of the Jews, and we were looking at the value of the sources with relation to looking at that specific key issue. Now remember, what you need to do, you need to offer a judgment with a debate. You need to look at the value of the sources, you need to look at their content, the provenance, their tone, and the context in which these sources were actually produced. Now, with regards to additional knowledge, I mentioned this just now, there is obviously a need for appropriate reference to the historical context, but it has to be linked to the sources. There are no marks for a display of knowledge. So be careful that you're not explaining things that have no relevance, because you will not get any extra marks, even though what you might be saying might be correct. It has to be extra knowledge in relation and linked to the sources that they give you. Now, remember as well, we spoke about the fact that the skills and knowledge from Unit 2, question 1, which is what you did in Year 12, that can actually be used, or some of it could be used, in this question if it's appropriate and relevant as well. So don't forget about your Year 12 work. If there's a point that you want to make which is relevant, then it could be awarded marks because you're bringing in your knowledge from your work in Year 12 if it is suitable, appropriate and relevant. Now, with regards to reliability, we did talk about these two words as well, which could be used in your source analysis. Objective, which means a source which informs, is balanced and is factual rather than being biased and opinionated. And subjective, which means it refers to information that's based on personal opinions. So it could be quite sort of emotional if it's a subjective source. We then focused on each of the sources and we did lots and lots of highlighting and underlining. Now, the first thing I suggested you did was to put the actual key issue next to the source if you wanted to, because that means you are focusing in on what the key issue is as you do your source analysis. You don't have to do it, it's just a suggestion. You would then highlight and underline, first of all, information from the attribution. So you would look at who's written it, where it's come from, any dates or any relevant information that was in that attribution. And then you would analyse the actual source, underlining and highlighting important bits of information from the content that they're giving you. But you take it a step further. You'd look at the tone in which it was written. You would then look at the strengths and the value of that particular source. Put it in context of what's going on at the time. Is there anything that you can add in that sort of sheds some extra light on that particular source? And also look at the limitations or biases, any weaknesses or any omissions. Now, these should all be in bullet points, even though I have written strengths and value, limitations, bias, weaknesses. That's just for you to be aware of what the minus and what the plus sign is. Obviously, you wouldn't have to write that in your little notes on your paper when you're making the notes, because remember, you haven't got much time. It's just about 10 minutes. We suggest you make these notes. You just use the plus and then you know what it means. You know you're looking for the strength and value, and use the minus to show that these are the limitations. Now, once you've made all of your notes, you would do that for the first one, the second and the third. And then when it comes to writing up, once you have written the point that you've made, I suggest to my students they cross that point off quickly so they can see what they've got left to write on their source analysis. They're not redoing information and wasting time putting the same point down twice or missing something out. They are crossing off what they've written so they can use the rest of the time on the bits of information that they need to put in. So exactly the same then with source B. You look at your attribution, underlining the important information there. You look at maybe writing what the focus is, reading the actual source and highlighting anything of importance within the source, looking at the tone of the source, and then doing the same thing with regards to the plus points. What are the strengths? What are the values of the source? Are there what within the context can you add into that information? And exactly the same with the minus. Okay, what are the limitations, biases or weaknesses or anything that's on omissions? What's been left out? And then we've got source C. And as you can see, exactly the same there with the tone. This one we did slightly differently because we talked about the context as well as a slightly different section, because there's a lot more that we could mention about what was going on at the time with this particular source. So it's in context, it's extra information in context of the actual source, so it is relevant and it will be awarded marks. And then we did the strengths and value, and we did the limitations, biases, weaknesses as well. So this is just another checklist, a different version of the one I just showed you earlier. There is an extra little bit here which says the linking of sources. So if, for example, your source A has said something in particular that you can comment upon when you analyse your source C, then that's a good thing to be able to do as well. So you can link in the sources if there is a link that you want to explain when you do your source analysis. Now, what we did last session then as well, we looked at possible sentence starters that you could use First of all, in your introduction. So in your introduction, things like the sources are only a small extract, so they're not comprehensive to the topic of, and you would slot in obviously your key issue there singularly. However, they each hold their own individual values. So you're saying that these three sources are of value, and you're saying that at the outset, which is obviously really, really good, that you're focusing on the question, the key issue, and you're saying that it has got some value. Okay, the sources do hold value. With the main body, it's absolutely essential, remember, that at least once you write for each source, the source is of value to an historian studying, and then you put your key issue in because, okay, and you would explain why, okay. It could be because it's written by somebody, and then it further adds to its value because maybe it's relatively valuable to a historian studying, obviously in our case it was opposition, because you would then mention it fails to mention something, if there's something within the context of what was going on at the time that you can bring in. Even if you struggle to understand the sources, because they're obviously in year 13 a little bit more in depth, a little bit longer, okay, a decent comment though, which gives a reason why the sources of value to an historian studying whatever the key issue is, it could potentially bump up your marks to a 20 out of 30, so it's worth putting that in. And remember, all of the sources will have a value, you just need to find them. And you can always give a mini judgment as you go through each source analysis as well in that main body. Now this comes from the WJC, and it was some examples of some contextual sentence starters that you could use. Some sentence starters to do with the value when you came to that part of the analysis, and some to do with the limitations. Okay, so again, have a little look through this and obviously use some of them if they're of relevance to you. Now remember, when you're using your highlighting, your underlining, or the notes that you're making, cross them out as you are writing up. So as I said earlier, you know what you've used, you know what you've got left to say, you're not repeating yourself, and you're not missing anything out. But remember this bit here, always tie in what you're saying back to why that source is of value. And then we reach the conclusion. So this is when you would need to compare the evidence across the sources. And this is when you would put them collectively into a value. So you would say something like, collectively the sources are of value to an historian saying. You could mention that they do have respective omissions and biases, and they are quite small extracts singularly, but when they're used together, then obviously it's much more, it provides a much more balanced overview. So that is a really strong conclusion then to end, saying that even though there are some little downsides to all of the sources being used, that collectively, when they're used together, it is a lot stronger for giving you a sense of why these sources are of importance. Just to end then, some top tips, okay? Make sure at least once, remember, you see the sources of value. Even if you struggle to understand the sources, make sure you say why they're of value, because that will potentially get you 20 out of 30. Make sure you do the conclusion on the collective value, the fact that you can use the three of these sources now collectively, and that makes them stronger and of more value. And also, each source will have a value, okay? They will not provide you with useless sources, so you just need to find out what that value is. Now, just some general do's and don'ts. Don't assess the source from a formula or trawl through them like off the checklist. You need to be able to let your answer flow. Okay, you need to comment on more than just the content and the attribution. Don't copy long sections of the source out. You don't need to. There's no need for a long historical introduction or for irrelevant background material, and you don't need to rank the sources. Okay, keep tying it back in to why that source is of value. Okay, and address that question. Very, very quickly, if you do all of that for the band 6, okay, you could be accessing marks from this area. So if you've given a sustained and accurate analysis and evaluation on the context, and you've given a full and substantiated judgment on the value of the sources to the particular key issue, then you could be getting into that band 6 characteristics, which is the top band. What I'm going to end with for question 1 are some commonly asked questions that my students ask me, and some of you might have some of these questions in your mind as well. So first of all, will we ever get more than 3 sources to evaluate? No, okay, for question 1, you will only ever have 3 sources, no more, no less. Can I use some of your suggestions or sentence starters and mix them with my own wording? Yes, of course. Okay, mix my sentence starters with your own and with the example that I gave from the WJC, because your teachers don't want to see everything written the same way. They want to see a variation in the way that you're attacking these sources. So yes, use the checklist, but mix up what you're saying, use some of the suggestions that have been made along with your own. Will we ever have secondary sources? No. For question 1, you will only ever have primary or contemporary sources made at the time. They will never be secondary. Now, if you have any additional questions on question 1, unit 4, then please remember you can ask them through the chat function, and I will address them at the end of the session, time permitting. Let's look at today's focus now, which is question 2/3, and that is looking at the essay skills. Now, first of all, let's start with the common terminology. Now, this question is actually based on AO1, which might not mean anything to you, but it's one of the key things that you need to look out for before you start your revision and any examination preparation or assessment preparation in your cases. And that is, you need to look out for the command terminology that is used for AO1 questions. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, questions for A-level history essays are actually phrased using a set of command terms. So it's important that you recognise what these terms are so that you know what's required of you when it comes to answering the question, and you can answer it then as effectively as you possibly can. So there are 6 command terms, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to run through them. This has come from the WJC, and they've got the command term on the left, and then they have the descriptor of what it means, and they've broken it down to slightly easier an explanation underneath. So I'm just going to focus on this bit under here. So the first command term would be discuss, okay, which might be in that essay question or one of the essay questions that you could choose to do. Now, what you need to do if you have a discuss question, you need to focus obviously on the main idea that's given in the question. You then make an argument in relation to other factors, and then you give a judgment, which is consistent and balanced and supported with factual evidence. So quite simple, you deal with what's given to you, you look at anything else of relevant factors, either supporting it or going against it, and then you would come to a balanced judgment at the end. You could have evaluate as a command term. So you have looking at the main idea in the question, you weigh up its impact and or role against other relevant factors, and then you come to a balanced judgment that's supported by factual evidence. How effective or how effectively, it could be another essay. Again, you focus on the main idea in the question, you make a judgment on the effectiveness, you weigh it against other factors that may have been equally or more or less effective, and then you give your judgment, obviously supported with factual evidence. Now, we've done 3 of these. You should be starting to see a pattern emerging here on what they want from you when you write your essay. So another command term is how significant. So again, you focus on the main idea in the question, you make a judgment on its significance, and then you consider it in relation to other factors that may have been equally more or less significant, and you bring about your judgment. How successful or how successfully. So again, you focus on the main idea in the question, you make your judgment on the level of its success, and you weigh it up against other factors that may have been equally more or less successful, and you end with your consistent and balanced judgment, which is supported by factual evidence. And the last command term that they could use is to what extent. Again, if you have an to what extent essay question, you focus on the main idea in the question, you make a judgment on its importance, you weigh it against other factors that may have been equally more or less important, and you make a consistent and balanced judgment. So we've got these 6 command terms: discuss, evaluate, how effective or effectively, how significant, to what extent, and how successful. Now, what I'm going to do on the next slide, I'll run through some examples from all the different depth studies from previous year's exams. You can have a look at how the exam board puts these command terms into the essay questions. Now, all I would like you to do as we run through them is to look at the wording, okay, of the questions, and also to look out for any essays from your particular depth study areas. So the first one is from depth study 2. And we can see straight away we have a discuss question there. And we've got depth study 5, and that is another discuss question. It's quite easy to spot the discuss questions. We've got depth study 3 here, Okay, to what extent were social reforms implemented between 1833 and 1848? Then we've got another depth study 3, and this time is from the same year, as you can see, but obviously if it's from the same year, they will normally use two different types of questions, command questions. So the one that appeared at the same time as this one was a how far do you agree? Okay, for the next one. We've got depth study 8 here, which is how far do you agree that Goering's 4-year plan was the most significant development in the Nazi economic policy in the period 33 to 45? And we have a depth study 4 example. We've got depth study 5 here, and we've got one from 2018, which is from depth study 3. Now you should be looking at these now and seeing how the exam board are putting together these questions, because there are similarities even though they come from different depth studies. So we've got an example here from depth study 7 from 2019. And depth study 5. To what extent there? We have depth study 4 and depth study 2. Now, hopefully that has given you a little bit of an idea of how the essays are actually put together and formulated. Okay, hopefully you spotted one of your essays from your depth studies there as well. So there are 6 possible command terms that could be used in these essays. Now, what I've done here is I've put them into a table for you, a nice easy way of looking at this information, and is condensed in a simplified way, and it's very effective to learn from this table I found. Okay, so you can see quite clearly that we've got focus on the main idea in the question that came up for each of the 6 command terms, and then when we get to effective, we have to make a judgment obviously on how effective that particular issue was that was in the question. Same thing with significant, same thing with successful, and same thing to what extent. Okay, we need to make a judgment. Then with relation to other ideas, obviously with discuss you bring in other factors. With evaluate you would then weigh up its impact or role against other relevant factors that you're bringing in. Again, with effective you'd weigh up, have they been equally more or less effective? With significant you consider it to other factors that might be equally more or less significant. With successful, weigh it up, and to what extent weigh it up. And each and every one of them wants a consistent and balanced judgment supported by factual evidence in the conclusion. Okay, so hopefully this table explains each of the command terms in a little bit more detail. Now, what I'm going to run through now is suggestions and top tips for answering the essay question from the WJC, and they give an example on their website of how they would go about answering this particular question. So you can see here we've got the 2 questions, and the candidate here has decided to go for question 2, which is Mary I's marriage to Philip of Spain was mainly responsible for the challenges she faced during her reign. Discuss. So first of all, the command term is found and highlighted. Okay, it's discuss, of course, and then they've highlighted the certain elements within the question that they need to focus on. So they focus on the main idea, and they need to consider it in relation to other relevant factors, and then make a consistent and balanced judgment supported by factual evidence, of course. So planning your response from the WJC. So first of all, you identify which essay you want to do, okay, and you plan. So once you've identified which one you want to do, you don't have to plan, but we do thoroughly recommend it, okay, because it does mean that students who plan give a more focused response in their essay, in their answer. Now, you can plan your answers on the question paper, or you can plan your answer on your booklet. If you do it in your written booklet, just remember to cross through so that whoever's marking it can see that that was your plan at the very end when you're finished with it. So highlight the key elements and the command term in the question to begin with. And even though I'm going to show you a WJC advice plan, it's not a definitive plan. You may have your own method, or your teachers might be able to recommend something that suits you better and suits your learning style. So it can be really helpful to try different styles of answering essays until you actually find something that suits you. Remember, keep your notes brief. They are notes after all, and you could be using perhaps a slightly different plan with different questions. Now, the more you practice essay writing, the better you will be at it, okay, for identifying the approaches which is the best one for that particular question. So for this question, the WJC suggests that you draw a simple table and you add headings that fit the actual question. So these actual headings would be challenge, as they are there, okay, evidence, because you need to back everything up with evidence, and the word responsible, okay. Once you've done this little table, you can fill it in then with brief notes and your plan will start to develop. So as you can see here, you've got challenge, evidence and responsible, okay. So the challenges would be listed, any evidence to back it up, and then responsible in the last column. Now, you may, according to WJC, want to use and take things a step further by using highlighters or coloured pens to actually bring more focus to the plan. So, for example, highlighting points that strongly support the statement in the question, those that can go either way, or maybe those that undermine the statement. So you've got another level of response in what you're going to be talking about and writing about. Okay, so you've taken your notes and taken them into, again, another further developed plan for your writing up section. Then, when it comes to answering the question, the WJC suggests that a brief process of making notes and organising yourself has now enabled you to pull everything together, and you're able to put an argument together that can be a clear and confident argument which states your opinion, which gives the evidence to support it, which will bring in alternative views, and then of course you could bring in your substantiated judgment at the very end. So no matter which approach you take, your plan will be able to guide you through the response. And remember, it doesn't have to be a table. Perhaps you've already got ideas from previous essay writing sessions that you've done, or maybe your teachers have given you your own plans as well. So whichever one you use, just remember these things need to be addressed. You focus on the set question, you organise your arguments logically so they form a coherent response. You debate the question as prompted by the command term. So obviously, if you had discuss, we've just looked at the discuss question, you might have to what extent. So you focus on the main idea in the question, you make a judgment on its importance, you weigh it up against other factors that may have been equally more or less important, and your aim is to make a consistent and balanced judgment that is supported by factual evidence. Now, whether or not you make little judgments throughout your response, you absolutely must put a conclusion in that draws all the arguments together in your answer and offer a final definitive answer to the set question. So what I have here is a Depth Study 8 example. So we have our two questions, okay, and you can see in this particular year of 2019, you would have that the choice of to what extent was propaganda mainly responsible for maintaining popular support to the Nazi regime between 33 and 45, or you would have how far do you agree that Göring's 4-year plan was the most significant development in Nazi economic policy in the period 33 to 45. So we've got the to what extent. Remember what you have to do for that, focus on the main idea, weigh it up against other factors, and obviously produce your balanced judgment. Or you would have your significant question, focus again on the main question, and make your judgment on the significance, consider other factors, and then bring your consistent and balanced judgment into it as well. Now what I have here is the WJC from their answer book, from their marking, okay, and the first thing I want to point out to you, in the mark scheme, it says that candidates are not expected to mention all the material referred to below. So as we look at it, don't worry and think, I would never have said that. That means I would never access the top marks. That might not be the case, because the next sentence here says that they'd be credited if there was anything that was a good point being made that was not in the mark scheme. So you could still get marks for things that you're saying that might not be in the mark scheme as well. Now then they would go on in the mark scheme and talk about the actual question. Okay, that was the question 2. You have to focus on the causation, consequence, continuity, change and significance where appropriate. Deploy knowledge and understanding from your previous learnings. Remember, work that you did from year 12 could come into this answer as well. And you offer an analysis and evaluation and then a judgment. Now this stays the same for all the questions. This little bit here, what changes is obviously the actual wording of the question that appears within it. And this is the actual answer. So at the top you would have what supports the actual question, then you would have the elements that challenge, and then you would have the fact that there needs to be a substantiated judgment as well. Okay, so as I said, don't worry if you think, oh, I would never have said that, or I don't understand what that means. You might have gone down a slightly different road and mentioned something different, which would still get you the marks. And it's exactly the same for the question 3 as well. Okay, so again, you're not expected to mention everything. You've got to do all of these things, which is exactly the same as in the other mark scheme. And then you have in this mark scheme what supports the actual question here that students could be commenting about, and then what they could be commenting about that actually challenges, and you've got your debate and judgment. Now, I know I've gone through this very, very quickly, but this might not be your actual depth study area. If it is, then obviously you can download this presentation later, pause it and actually read through the different sections. Or if it's not your depth study area, you can look at other WJC questions and look up the mark schemes. They're all available to you on the WJC site, and do exactly the same by looking to see, would I have answered this? What sort of thing does the examiner want from me? Now, again, this is the Band 6 characteristics. So if you gave an essay that was focused on the exact key concept, covered the whole set period, debated the main developments and reached a substantiated judgment, you could be going into that top Band 6 of the marking. So next steps or suggestions for question 2/question 3. As I said, go on the WJC site, have a look at the essays that have been set for your particular depth study. Which essay in that particular year would you choose? Would you prefer to do a question 2 or a question 3? You know, have a look at it. Perhaps there's a need for additional revision. If there was one area, so I wouldn't do that question, I'd prefer the other one. And if you wouldn't want to do either of them, then there's definitely a need for looking over your work a bit more. Have a go at the question, use the technique maybe given today of the table form or ones that you've already mastered for essay writing, and time yourself actually answering the question. And look at the mark scheme then and compare your answer to the actual mark scheme. And the same next step for question 1, really, okay? Make sure you understand everything on the specification, because you need it for your question 1 and for the essay question. Download the spec if you don't have it. Practice the techniques given today and time yourself. So with question 1, we do say 10 to 15 minutes to make the notes around the sources, and then 45 minutes to actually write up your answers. Now, I'm just going to do a very quick true or false quiz just to see how many of you have been focusing. Now, don't worry about sending any answers. All I want you to do is to think about what you would put true or false to these statements. Hopefully you'll get them correct. So write them down or shout them out, whatever you prefer. So for question 1, you will always have 3 sources. That is, of course, true. You will. The sources may be secondary. No, that's false. You will always have primary or contemporary sources. You need to mention the tone of the sources. Yes, you definitely do. Put as much additional information as you can into your source analysis. No, that's false, of course, isn't it? Okay, because we will only want the information that's of relevance to that source, to the context of what's going on at the time. It's good to write a pre-learned, very structured and formulated source analysis. That's false, isn't it? Okay, we want you to use everything that's on the checklist, but we want it to flow. So we want you to be able to write it in a very flowing, free way. Now then, with question 2/3, you have to do 2 essays. That's of course false. You should know the answer to that. You choose to do one of the essays. There is no need to plan your answer. Bit of a trick question, you don't have to, but we strongly recommend that you do. So I would say that is false, okay, because planned answers are always more focused and will always get higher marks. You need to focus on the command word in that particular essay. That is true, of course. In your essay, you should state your opinion, support it and debate alternative views. That is true, okay? And finally, for question 5, you should provide a consistent and balanced judgment and support it with factual evidence. That is true as well. So hopefully you've got all of those questions correct. Now, don't forget that the previous sessions and recordings and resources are all online. And if you access the recording section, it'll bring up the different subjects. It's not just history that's there, the other subjects are there as well. And you've got Mr. Morell's 2 sessions. They are there recorded for you to access when you wish. And also my last session, and obviously this session will go on as well in time. So a big thank you, first of all, for attending these sessions. Mr. Morell and I hope that they've been of some help to you, and as you go into the evidence gathering section of your studies, we wish you the best of luck, and for whatever your career path will be, whichever road you head down post year 13. Now, if you have any questions, I have a small amount of time left. I can answer anything that you might have now on the live chat function until the end of the session if you have anything. So I'll just check to see if there are any questions available. Okay, at the moment there are no questions and we only have a couple of seconds left. So if there is anything that you want to ask, now is the chance. Okay, there doesn't seem to be anything coming through. So thank you once again for attending and for obviously supporting us in these presentations that we've done over the past 4 weeks. Thank you very much.